Okay, so today we're going to cover neuroendocrinology. We're going to talk about how hormones work. We're going to talk about the difference between hormones and neurotransmitters and all those things. So first let's talk about what hormones are. So these are chemicals. They're secreted by a particular one cell group. They travel through the bloodstream and they act on targets. We have our endocrine glands, those release hormones within the body, and then we have exocrine glands, and those use ducts to secrete the fluids. For example, we can look at tears and sweat, and they basically secrete those outside of the body. Here is a nice kind of schematic of the different kinds of endocrine structures, whether it's a gland or an organ. So here you can see, for example, the hypothalamus, and that helps to control hormone secretions. If we go into, so this part of the brain here, we have the pituitary gland located here. You can see kind of blown up from there. The pituitary gland is broken into the anterior and posterior pituitary, which have sort of different functions, with the anterior pituitary being involved in communication with the thyroid. The posterior pituitary gland is really important for things like water and salt balance. The pineal gland, which is located kind of in the back here, this is really important for body rhythms, and we're going to talk about that when we get to sleep and consciousness and body rhythms there. Also important for things like reproductive maturation. We also have the thyroid, which we'll cover briefly, which is important for metabolism. If you have, for example, an underactive thyroid, you might find that you are gaining weight. It's really difficult to keep weight off. Also involved in the whole systems with hunger and things like that, sort of all communicating with one another. And then we have the adrenal glands, the pancreas, the gut, the gonads, etc., which all have very specific functions, which we'll talk a little bit about as we go. So let's talk a little bit about how hormones act in the body and what kinds of communication that they have. So if we look at the two sort of forms of chemical communication, we have endocrine communication, which a hormone is released into the bloodstream and that acts on specific target tissues. And then we have synaptic communication, which we also call neurocrine function, and that involves chemical release and diffusion across the synapse. So two specific kinds of actions. We'll talk about other types of communication as we go along. So we have autocrine function, and one thing to think about autocrine is like self, right? It's automatic, and so think of the autocrine communication as like self-secreting. It's where a chemical is a released chemical acts on the releasing cell, so it's like it's like on autopilot. It's a self-secreting. And then we have paracrine function. And so think of paracrine as next to secreting communication. So this would be where the released chemical diffuses to nearby targets. So autocrine is self-secreting. Paracrine is basically releasing to a neighboring target. And then we have pheromone and allomone function. When it comes to pheromone communication, we have hormones that can be used to communicate between individuals of the same species. And so we see pheromones being released in the environment. For example, here, this dog or wolf may be sniffing the grass, this tree here, where another dog or wolf has urinated on this, and this animal is able to understand this communication with its own species. Allomone function is where we see chemicals being released by one species that affect the behavior of another species. So here, this would be this bee is essentially reacting to the chemicals released by this flower. And so if we're looking at the general principles of hormone action, so there's a couple of sort of rules or principles that we have to kind of keep in mind. So number one, hormones act in a gradual fashion. And we're going to talk about the difference between how neurotransmitter action works as opposed to hormone actions. But one thing to really consider is that hormones are gradual. They act in a gradual fashion. They last longer. Their effect is longer. Hormones act by changing the probability or intensity of a behavior. We're going to talk about sort of permanent versus non-permanent changes. There's a reciprocal relationship between behavior and hormones, one affecting the other and then having this reciprocal interaction, and that a hormone may have multiple effects. And a particular behavior might be affected by multiple hormones. So it's not necessarily a one-to-one interaction. We typically have a behavior that is a result of many hormone interactions. And so if we look at a single hormone, like for example, A here, that might affect multiple target tissues in various locations throughout the body. And then we might have a singular process, which is sort of illustrated by target Y here. So we might have a similar process or a body organ that might be sensitive to several different kinds of hormones. So we have here, target X with hormone A. This is being, sensitive to one particular hormone, whereas this we have multiple hormones that a target could be sensitive to. So this, of course, adds to the complexity of what the hormone can accomplish. Another interesting principle that we can talk about is that hormones often have a pulsatile secretion pattern, meaning that we experience it in bursts. Some hormones are going to be controlled by circadian clocks in the brain. We haven't gotten there yet, but we'll talk about the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and which is located in the hypothalamus, and we're going to talk about sort of how these different clocks function. And how they work to respond to particular cues. For example, light is a way that these hormones are reacting to the presence of light. And that is a process that we'll cover. And when we get to sleep and circadian rhythm, hormones can interact with other hormones, can change their effects based off of what we are able to respond to. And hormones are only affecting cells that has a receptor protein for that hormone. So just like we had talked about sort of neurotransmitters having a receptor type, hormones are really going to only be able to affect the cells that has a receptor protein for that specific hormone, similar to how we look at neurotransmitters. So let's look at the similarities and differences of hormones and neurotransmitters. So when we look at neurotransmitters versus hormones. So neurotransmitters are stored and secreted by neurons, and hormones are stored and secreted by endocrine glands. Okay. The neural communications, their neural communication travels to very precise destinations, whereas hormonal communication is widespread. It's spread out throughout the body, and it's going to be picked up by cells that have the proper receptor type. Neural messages, so messages from neurotransmitters and neurons, are very rapid, and hormonal messages are much slower and longer lasting. And if we look at the distance, so the distance traveled by neurotransmitters is different. So the synaptic cleft is a very, very small area. This is, looking at, the presynaptic cell to the postsynaptic cell, and we have this cleft right here. It's a very small distance. Whereas when we look at hormones, they're going to be traveling a much longer distance, in some cases like over a meter. And so they have longer distances to go because they have other targets to spread to. So thinking about these similarities and differences, like where are they stored and secreted? When they're traveling, where are they going, right? Is it very precise? Is it further spread? How fast and slow are they going? And the distance. What is the distance traveled? So if you were to be asked a question, for example, on the difference between hormones and neurotransmitters, knowing some of these differences in these principles are a good thing. Now, looking at some more principles. So we have neuroendocrine or neurosecretory. These cells are neurons that release hormones into the blood. And we have neuropeptides. These are Peptides that are used by neurons, they can act as neuromodulators and alter sensitivity to transmitters. So basically sending signals back for us to know how much, how little, what is going on in terms of release. And then looking at the different kinds of hormones and the different structures. So we have peptide hormones. These are also referred to as protein hormones, and that is a string of amino acids. We have amine hormones, and these are modified amino acids. They're also called monoamine hormones. And then we have steroid hormones here. And these are made up of 4 rings of carbon atoms, and they're derivatives of cholesterol. So you can kind of see molecularly like the different structures of the chemical structures of hormones. And then just kind of breaking down and looking at examples of each, right? So if we look at the peptide hormones, we're looking at like follicle stimulating hormones, luteinizing hormones, thyroid stimulating or TSH hormone, growth hormone, insulin, prolactin, oxytocin, vasopressin. All of these are examples of the peptide hormones. Many of you might be familiar with this if you ever had your thyroid function checked, for example, to see if you have an overactive or underactive thyroid. You might be familiar with this right here because that's something that we can test for. Those amine hormones, adrenaline, epinephrine, norepinephrine, other thyroid hormones, melatonin. We're going to talk about melatonin later. And those steroid hormones are all like estrogen, progesterone, androgens like testosterone, glucocorticoids like cortisol, which we'll talk about further on. So looking at continuing to look at some of the actions on the of hormones, like looking at, for example, cellular actions. Hormones are going to exert effects on cells and tissues in the body by doing things like promoting proliferation, promoting growth, differentiation of cells. In some cases, we see differentiation, for example, of the sex organs. So in utero, as development occurs, the differentiation between having the organ tissue differentiate between vaginal tissue versus penile tissue, and those are permanent effects that we see happening during development. It also works to modulate cell activity as well, and can do a really good job of enforcing certain behaviors, which we'll talk about later through this process. So how do hormones exert those influences, right? How do they do these sorts of things? How do they do these sorts of things in terms of at the cellular level? So if we look at 2 different ways of how hormones influence cellular action. The first one, if looking at protein and amine hormones, they're binding to specific receptors that are on the surface of a cell. They cause the release of the second messenger, and then that's going to change potentially the function of the cell. And we've talked about the same sort of process. Remember, we talked about those G-coupled proteins. So you guys should be familiar with this kind of cell and this kind of receptor type. If we look at these specific protein and amine hormones, they tend to act really rapidly. When they bind to the extracellular part of the receptors, we're seeing the receptor change shape, just like we see with neurotransmitters. And then this intracellular part is going to activate a second messenger, and then that is going to then lead to something happening, more or less receptors being created. It might be altered function. We need more or less of this. And so in some cases, we can see that that a particular second messenger, for example, cyclic AMP or CAMP, that's a second messenger that's going to transmit messages of many peptide and amine hormones. We can also see cyclic guanosine monophosphate or GMP, cyclic GMP, and those are really widespread second messengers that can change cellular function as well. Now, if we look at steroid action, right, steroid hormones, these are passing through the cell membrane. They're binding to receptors inside of the cell here. The steroid hormones are a little bit different from the protein and amine hormones in that they act more slowly. These receptors are found within target cells. Their receptors are found within target cells. And we're seeing that when these steroid receptor complexes form, they alter protein production and they tend to produce pretty long-lasting effects. And the steroid receptor complex binds to DNA and actually acts as a transcription factor, which can control gene expression as well. So these can have a pretty impressive impact on the cells. And so these steroid hormones, what they do is they diffuse passively into the cell. And inside the target cells, we have these large receptor molecules that bind to the steroid hormones, and then that's what binds to the DNA, and it causes like an increase in the production of some gene proteins, and then a decrease in production of others. And this is where we see, it being able to exert a genomic effect. Right. So this is the steroid hormones have a pretty significant impact. And the steroids that are made in the brain are called neurosteroids. And the brain also produces a particular enzyme called aromatase, which then can convert testosterone from the testes into estrogens, for example. So looking at how the cellular actions are going to sort of feed back into the cells. So how are these hormones regulated, right? So if we look at feedback systems, okay, this is how hormones are regulated. So it uses a negative feedback. So in the simplest type of negative feedback control, an endocrine gland releases a hormone that not only acts on a target, but also feeds back into an autocrine fashion to inhibit further hormone secretion that you can see kind of right here. And so these, hormones are regulated by these feedback systems. And the negative feedback system, which is further inhibiting secretion, this is this autocrine feedback loop, which is involved in endocrine cells releasing a hormone whose presence feeds back onto the endocrine cells. So basically, it is allowing for the modulation of this hormone because it is going to inhibit further production or release of additional hormones. We also have the hormone from the endocrine gland acting on target cells to produce a specific set of biological effects. So the consequences of the effects can actually be detected by the endocrine gland, inhibiting further the hormone release. And so we can have target cell feedback. And in this, the hormone is acting on its target cell, having a biological effect, and the biological effect is then detected by the endocrine gland, and then further release is inhibited. So just another example of a feedback loop that we see here. We can have even more complex systems, and usually those are going to involve the hypothalamus. So in many feedback systems, the brain is going to be involved. The hypothalamic region drives the endocrine gland through either neural or hormonal signals, and the target organ signals the brain to inhibit this drive. So in this case, the hypothalamus can actually direct hormone release. So the brain detects the hormone's effects and then exerts negative feedback on the hypothalamus, and so that can also modulate some of these release. Now, we talked about the pituitary gland before, so we're going to talk about another mechanism where we see brain involvement. So we talked about the hypothalamus, so looking at the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary and the endocrine gland. All of these are more complex feedback mechanisms where the feedback is regulated by a variety of hormones through multiple routes. So the anterior pituitary gland may also be involved in cases where the pituitary releases tropic hormones that are going to affect other endocrine cells. The hypothalamus uses releasing hormones to regulate pituitary's release of those tropic hormones. And then that negative feedback goes back to both the pituitary and the hypothalamus. So just increasing other complex systems. So let's talk a little bit about the endocrine glands. So if we look at the pituitary gland, this releases important hormones, right? We have two parts of the pituitary gland. We have the anterior part here and the posterior part here. And the two different sections, they have different functions and they have sort of different jobs. So we also have the pituitary stalk, and the infibulum, and that is going to connect the pituitary to the hypothalamus to allow for that communication to happen. And so the stalk has many different axons. They extend only to the posterior pituitary, though. And it has like lots of richly supplied blood vessels, carries information only to the anterior pituitary. So when we look at the posterior, so looking at the so just to kind of reiterate, just so that you're aware, this pituitary stalk here, okay, connects the pituitary gland to the hypothalamus, and the axons, there are some axons that extend only to the posterior pituitary, and then they have blood vessels that extend only to the anterior pituitary. So, there's a communication with the stalk to these different parts of the pituitary gland. If we look at the posterior pituitary gland, it is responsible for secreting two very important principal hormones. So we have vasopressin and we have oxytocin. So with vasopressin, it is important for increasing blood pressure. It also inhibits urine formation. It's also an antidiuretic hormone, meaning that it's going to inhibit urine formation. When it comes to oxytocin is really important for reproductive and parenting behavior. And when a person is giving birth, it's important for that, for the contractions in the uterus. And then after birth, it's important for the milk letdown reflex. And so that's a reflex that occurs in response to, for example, a baby crying, or, just from, initiating a breastfeeding session. Neurons in the supraoptic nuclei and the paraventricular nuclei of the hypothalamus, they synthesize these hormones. They also transport them along the axons in the pituitary stalk. These are two examples, and we talked about this very briefly before, about examples of hormones that also work as neurotransmitters. And so vasopressin and oxytocin are two of those hormones that also serve as neurotransmitters in the hypothalamus. So if you were to be asked, for example, what are a couple of examples of hormones that play both roles of neurotransmitter and hormones, these are two great examples of that. And so hypothalamic neurons, they synthesize those releasing hormones. Axons from these cells converge on the median eminence, which is above the pituitary stalk. And the releasing hormones are secreted into the blood vessels, and this is the hypophyseal portal system. The releasing hormones are then carried to the pituitary gland, which releases the tropic hormones, and then the hypothalamus is influenced by these circulating messages, such as other hormones, also by synaptic inputs from other brain regions. And so looking at those tropic hormones, if we can look at 6 different ones. The anterior pituitary releases these 6 tropic hormones. So we have adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. This controls the production and release of adrenal cortex steroid hormones. We have the thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. We've talked a little bit about that. That's increasing thyroid hormone release. The follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, that stimulates egg-containing follicles in females, or sperm production in males. Luteinizing hormone, or LH, that stimulates follicles to form the corpora lutea in females, and testosterone production by the testes in males. Prolactin stimulates lactation in females. It's also involved with parental behavior, and growth hormone influences growth, mostly during sleep. And the stomach hormone ghrelin also evokes growth hormone release, so involved with the process of hunger and things like that. And so this next example is just kind of a schematic of how these particular hormones are released, where they're released, where the targets are, examples and functions of these different hormones. So these hormones are produced the hormones produced in the anterior pituitary. These includes these tropic hormones, which control endocrine glands and directly affect other structures, such as bones. So I'm going to end the lecture right here, and then I'm going to pick it back up so that the lecture doesn't get too long. And so come back and we will continue talking about